Yes, I see that I should be a little bit more clear on my discovery when it comes to the nature of space, because actually it's a really big deal. I mean, it's a major breakthrough, and it's a revolution actually in physics and in theoretical physics and in the way to understand the universe. The nature of space, I mean, just to understand the nature of space in a completely different way than has been done before, to present a model of a true paradigm shift is a big thing. It's like a Copernican revolution, you know, more or less. It's like a Copernican revolution if we really see the implications of this paradigm shift. I don't mean to introduce a paradigm shift. I just mean to introduce my discovery. Whether it becomes a paradigm shift or not, who knows? If it becomes a paradigm shift, it will take at least 100 years from now. So that will, if science will accept this discovery and find it to be true and valid, reasonable and justified, then, even then, it will take around 100 years for it to be somewhat accepted or even perhaps mainstream in science and in physics. Who knows? But it is a big deal. It's a major breakthrough. It's a revolution in a sense. It's a Copernican revolution when it comes to the understanding of space. So the summary of this discovery, or the summary of my model, the summary of this understanding of space is like this. Space doesn't exist. And that's why it exists as space. Space doesn't exist. It cannot exist. And this is the deepest secret about the universe. It's the deepest secret about the universe whatsoever. There is no deeper secret in the universe than this. The nature of space, to truly understand the nature of space, is the deepest secret of the universe. Is the most basic, most number one insight when it comes to physics, when it comes to the understanding of the universe. So, and no one before me has truly understood it, unless they perhaps were an unknown monk or mystic or scientific genius living alone in a cabin somewhere 500-600 years ago. Stephen Hawking has not understood this and would he would never have been able to understand it. I can say more or less quite clearly. Michio Kaku may be able to understand it. Neil deGrasse Tyson will probably not be able to understand it, but at least it makes sense to present the discovery to him, because he's such a scientific superstar, you know. So it's a funny thing, you know, these things. Even Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote the book *Sapiens*, as I mentioned and referred to in my first The Nature of Space video, also makes this same insane mistake, you know, that space and matter, like everything was created, absolutely everything that exists was created during the Big Bang. Which is, of course, complete nonsense. You know, I mean, you don't have to be more than 12 or 13 years old to understand that it's just simply pure nonsense. And 80% of science and of physics is swimming around in this nonsense, and it just doesn't make sense anymore, because we have to grow out of that paradigm. And in order to grow out of that paradigm, we have to open our eyes to a new model, to a new discovery, to a new way of understanding space. And the only way to understand space in a real, justified, relevant, and valid way is to see my model, because then it will open up a lot more windows. It's a sad thing that especially Stephen Hawking and famous scientists like this don't understand space. And the reason why they don't understand it is, I guess, perhaps because of Einstein, because it's because of the space-time model of Einstein, which, as I've said before, applies only to perception. It applies only to human consciousness. It applies only to the point of perception. The theory of general relativity by Einstein refers only to the relationship between phenomena in space, which means the observer. It applies only to the existence of the observer. If you remove the position of the observer, then Einstein's work doesn't make any sense. It's physical. It's rubbish as physics. If you include the observer, the point of perception, then Einstein is perfect. Then everything's fine, everything's good. But if you remove the observer from the model, from the equation, then nothing of what Einstein developed during his space-time theories makes any sense. It only makes sense, it only pertains to the situation where you set the position of the observer. It applies only to perception. It applies only to the relationship between phenomena in space. If you remove the point of observation, the whole equation of Einstein falls to pieces. And as some good scientists of today say, they say that the space-time theory of Einstein is doomed. It's spoken for. It won't live more than 5 years. It's going to crash. It's going to dissolve. It's going to crumble, and it should do so, because it is no. It just is no theory of space. Einstein's theory of space-time and of space is no theory of space. It's the theory of that which the observer observes in space. When you set the observer, the point of observation, the point of perception, then Einstein is perfect, because it's the theory of relativity. So everything makes sense with the observer and with the perception, because then you describe the relationship between perception and perceived objects in space, which is what Einstein did. But he did not explain space. He did not go into the primary insight. What is space? And where, of course, where does matter come from? Which is completely different. That is a really hard problem. That's a different topic altogether. It's a different thing. But I say this because it's important to say it. So Einstein is very good and valid and important when it comes to understanding space-time anyway, but space-time applies only to perception. If you remove perception, space-time doesn't make any sense. If you remove the observer, then space-time doesn't make any sense. So we have to remove the observer, we have to remove the perception in order to understand the nature of space. That is just elementary. It has to be done. It must be done. We have to remove the observer from the game, from the equation, from the analysis. We have to remove perception. We have to remove the observer so that we can understand space as it is, without any observation whatsoever, without any human program to distort it, without any consciousness, without any point of perceptual reference. This is very, very, very important. So, to understand space, in my opinion, is very, very important. We have to understand the underlying nothingness that actually is space, the invisible nothingness that we cannot see. We see space because space is illumined by light. You know, if there were no light, we wouldn't see, right? But we see space. We see space because of the illumination of matter in space. We see, and light is matter, you could say, because we could call it waves or matter. It doesn't matter if we call it matter or waves. If we call it matter or antimatter, it doesn't matter, because even antimatter is matter. So, because it's something rather than nothing, you could say. I mean, yeah. If you want to understand space, you have to understand that it has never been created and it can never collapse. It is the complete nothingness. It is the perfect nothingness. It is the nothingness that is so absolute that it cannot have been created, because it's an absolute nothingness. It simply doesn't exist. And that is why it exists as space, because space is actually an environment for that which takes place in space. Space is an environment for that which takes place in space. Without this nothingness, without this invisible nothingness, then the thing that we call space could not occur in space. It couldn't exist in space, because the supreme nothingness, the absolute nothingness, has to be there to provide space for space, so to speak. To provide space for space, or to provide, yes. The complete, supreme, absolute nothingness, which is the nature of space, has to be there to provide space for space, to provide space for that which we call space, to provide space for the universe, to provide space for planets and stars and protons and electrons and quarks and all the elementary particles, subatomic particles that fly around in this dance. The supreme, absolute, clinical pure, the clinically pure nothingness that is the nature of space, has to be here, has to be everywhere, in order to make space as we perceive it possible. If that clinically perfect nothingness is not here as the underlying basis of everything, as the underlying platform, as the invisible underlying platform, then nothing can take place. Even space doesn't have any space to take place in if there is no underlying invisible nothingness there. The underlying invisible nothingness, the clinical nothingness that constitutes that is the nature of space, must be there so that space can take place in space, and so that everything that exists in space can take place in space. Nature is that which occurs in space. That's what nature is. That is the perfect definition of nature. Nature is that which takes place in space. This is the perfect definition of nature. Nature is that which takes place in space. And we cannot define nature, because we cannot define the quark, we cannot define the proton, the electron, because science, we know that it's actually not a proton, it's actually not an electron, it's actually not a quark, you know. It's something that we cannot define. We have given it a name, and we have given it a name because of the instruments with which we measure these phenomena. But the instruments by which we measure these phenomena, these elementary particles, these instruments create the results. We get the results that our instruments produce. First, the first instrument is, of course, our human program. The nervous system and the brain by which and through which we experience and perceive the world, through our own optical reality, which is an optical illusion, of course. Our optical reality is an optical illusion. We have to understand that. So we view the world through the human program. That's the first instrument and the first obstacle, of course, in scientific research. Then we apply a secondary instrument, namely the microscope. We apply a secondary instrument, the microscope, in the lab, in the laboratory, to measure, or the Hadron Collider in CERN, or whatever, a Large Hadron Collider, or whatever instruments we use, we create something that gets interpreted by the human program. And it also gets, in a sense, developed or created by the instruments with which we measure it. So we partake in the creation of the results that we see as nature, as the building blocks of nature. The building blocks of nature are actually created by our own optical reality, which is an optical illusion, in a way. Science knows this, or grown-up scientists know this, and this is the basis, this is the ABC of pure, true, hardcore analytical science, so to speak. If you have no awareness about the way that we perceive things, if we have no awareness about the instrument, the human program, with which we perceive space or anything in space, then we cannot conduct science. And if we don't understand that the instrument, the Large Hadron Collider, or a microscope, or a telescope, or whatever, is also an instrument then that to some degree creates the results that we see. Then if we don't understand this, the problem or the implications of the first primary instrument, which is the human program, the secondary instrument, which is the instrument with which we measure reality. If we don't understand these implications, then we cannot conduct science. You know, then we are in kindergarten and we should be playing games of Monopoly or something like that. But science means to decipher the human program. Science means to decipher how neuroscience decides what we see. You know, science is about understanding how the human program produces reality. You know, that's what science is. Science means to understand how the human program produces reality. That is the primary step of real analytical science, and neither Stephen Hawking never did that. Roger Penrose or people like that never investigated these things, never even made them a part of the equation. Of course, it's a part of the curriculum, it's a part of the thinking, it's a part of the analysis, yes, of course, on the chamber and in the back of the brain. But it's not a part of the abstract, of the paper, of the conclusion, of the hypothesis, of the models that they present. So what I'm presenting here is actually a revolution within science, in a way. It's a Copernican revolution. It's a big deal. It's a major thing. It's a breakthrough. So this is true clarity. We have to come to the primary insight. What is space? What is the nature of space? I have explained it. The nature of space is the absolute, supreme, clinically pure nothingness, you know? that has to exist in order to give space for anything else to occur in space. Even that which we call space must have somewhere to take place. Space must have somewhere to take place. That which we call space, which is what we see, which we might call the universe needs a place to take place. If the universe doesn't have a place to take place, then it cannot take place. It cannot occur, because there is no place for the universe to take place. There is no space for that which we call space to take place. So we need this invisible, clinical, supreme nothingness that's just there, ultimate nothingness. It's just here, it's everywhere, all the time. It has no borders, it was never created, and it cannot cease to exist. It will never change. It is the unchangeable. It is the only part of nature that never changes. Everything else, besides this clinically pure nothingness, changes, because everything else beside this clinical nothingness is nature, is energy, is matter, is particles, is waves, is that which we call the universe in motion. And the universe in motion, or nature in motion, that's what we call time, because we experience this motion, we experience this with our own consciousness, awareness, and perception. So time, to some degree, is actually just the experience of the perception of space. We measure time by how we perceive that which happens in space. And that which happens in space is only nature. It's the movement of nature. It's the movement of that which takes place in space. Well, all right. So space was never created. Space is that which doesn't and cannot exist as anything else than that which does not exist. Space is that which exists by the way of non-existence. Space is that which exists because it doesn't exist. Space doesn't exist, and that is why it exists as space. Space exists because it doesn't exist. So the true nature of space is that which everything in space needs to take place. If that clinical nothingness was not there, then there would not be any space for space to take place, and there would not be any space for that which takes place in space to take place. Just wouldn't be any space for it. Everything would collapse. Everything would be the Big Bang moment. Everything would be the singularity, as we call it. You know, the Big Bang is the singularity, and the singularity is only density. That's what the singularity is. That's what the Big Bang is. The Big Bang is a density that became so dense that it exploded. The Big Bang is just ultimate density. You know, that's what the Big Bang is. The Big Bang is ultimate density, which is the result of the subtraction of everything, of every matter in the environment, because of gravity, and perhaps other forces that we have not yet discovered. But when it comes to the organization of the universe and the organization of matter, then gravity is, of course, even if it is a very weak force compared to the other electromagnetic forces, it is still the major architect. It is still the major force, because it is that which decides how the universe plays out in a physical sense, in a physical form. Gravity is that which makes the earth round. Gravity is that which makes the sun round. Gravity is that which makes the universe look the way that it looks. Gravity is that which is the architect, you could say, the invisible architect of matter on a large scale, on a big scale. But anyway, so this is my new model. This is my Copernican revolution within science. This is my new discovery, and I thought I should treat it fairly because it is a big deal. So I try to serve the nature of this discovery in a way that it deserves by this talk. I'm presenting a new model of understanding the nature of space. That which takes place in space, that is physics, and that is not my field. I cannot compete in there. I cannot do anything in there. That's not my field. I don't have that skill. I don't have that education. I don't know anything about that. I'm talking about nature from the point of an amateur, but when it comes to the nature of space, I am simply presenting a new model, a new paradigm, which could mean, to some sense, to some degree, a little revolution, a little Copernican revolution within physics, within the understanding of the universe as it is, within science. Especially when we see it in relationship to my other primary insight, that in order to understand space, in order to do any scientific research, we have to understand and decipher and see the human program and the implications of the human program and how the human program produces the world as we see it. And the human program is, of course, the interaction between the brain and the nervous system, and how our perception works within the machinery of the human program, within the machinery of the brain, so to speak, within consciousness, which I do believe is created by biology. I do believe that consciousness is a result of chemicals and electromagnetic forces in the brain. I do believe that the human brain is the birthplace of consciousness, because some people, even in science, think that consciousness might be the whole soup that we're living in, and that we're just a part of that consciousness in a way. We are waking up in that consciousness, so to speak, when we start conscious life. But anyway, this is my contribution to scientific research when it comes to, or thinking, scientific thinking or philosophical thinking, when it comes to scientific thinking, analytical thinking, when it comes to the nature of space. And of course, it's my also contribution when it comes to seeing the importance of understanding the implications of that which the human program produces, and that we see as a result of the production of that which the human program produces for us in this world, in this space that surrounds us, in this space that is our environment. And that is an environment that would not exist if it was not that which does not exist. Our environment exists because there is something that does not exist, and that which does not exist, that is the nature of space, the invisible underlying nothingness, which is the nature of space, and which makes it possible for space to take place in space, for that which we call space to take place in space. And it is that which makes it possible to make everything that occurs, everything in nature, to take place in space. Thank you.